Hi, everyone, and welcome to another conversation. Today, I'm joined by a good friend, Renal Mudlia, and we're going to be chatting about some of the things we've learned from the moment of cochlear implant switch on. I think anybody who's considering cochlear implants, there's so much build up before actually having the surgery and then the switch on. There's lots to be learned during that time, and I'm sure we'll have a conversation at some point about that. But we've felt that we've learned a lot since then, and we hope that some of the things that we share with you today will be insightful and helpful. We're going to divide this session into two, part one and two, and we'll be starting with part one. So just to kick us off, thanks so much for joining us, Renal. And perhaps you could just let us know, how many children do you have? How many cochlear implants do you care for? And especially, what was that time leading up to your switch on like? And specifically the switch on itself. How did it meet the expectations that you had?
Great. This is with everyone. I have two little kids who wear cochlears. So I have Emma, and she wears a hearing aid and she wears a cochlear implant. And then I have my little Noah, and he wears two cochlear implants. And so altogether, I'm taking care of three cochlear implants and a hearing aid. So Emma, she was implanted when she was just over two, and Noah when he was 1, and then at age 2. Emma, she was slightly later in finding out that she was deaf, but Noah we found out when he was born that he was deaf. So we trialed out hearing aids before we decided on cochlear implants. So to answer the question about the expectations around the cochlear implants, so with Emma, so we'll start off with her because that was our first round. So with her, we didn't know what to expect. We didn't have any kind of warning or information, minimal input at that time. We didn't have friends to talk to. The only input we had at that time was our audiologist, and minimal from our ENT. Well, we did get some information from our ENT as well. And the information we got, or the warning we got, was that don't expect too much on the first day. So we didn't expect too much. And Emma was different because she had access to sound. And whereas with Noah, he had no access to sound. So even with my two children, it was very different on that first day of switch on. So with Emma, she was completely not phased on the first day of switch on. She already had access to sound with her hearing aid, and so it didn't bother her too much. It was not much for her. For Noah, on the other hand, he was not getting much input from his hearing aids at all. So with him, it was a slow progress. So initially we saw nothing, but as time went on, we started to see a response. So I think the main thing I want to say is that it really does depend on your expectation is, should depend on whether your child or the user has access to sound or not, and also how old your child is, how much you can explain to them, how much communication you have with them, and also what your information is from your audiologist or the people around you, and that nothing really happens on that first day. It's a journey, it's a process, and it's often that you only start seeing some benefits or results sometimes months later. How about you? How was it for you?
Yeah, so similar. I think I also was tentative. I know one sees lots of YouTube clips and things of this amazing moment. And I know that is amazing for some people, but it isn't for others. So I care for 6 cochlear implants, and so I had 6 separate switch-ons. And my kids were a little bit older, and we did have language, so I could also get some insight into what the experience was. Um, and for the child who went first, she really hated the experience. And actually, I remember on the way home feeling quite disappointed when she told me she never wants to go back to the audiologist again if it's going to be like that.
Oh.
And that was kind of like, yeah, you felt like you were making a good decision, and blood, sweat, and tears in the decision, only for it to feel like a negative experience to her. But she soon did get used to it. But that was her experience. And second time around, she was very anxious because of that first experience, and also didn't find it pleasant. I also remember her explaining to me, she said, say something. So I said something. She said, well, all I'm hearing is, and she clapped out the syllables. So she was trying to show me that I don't know what you're saying. I can hear it. I can't understand it. It's not meaningful language to me yet. So that was really helpful for me, just to get insight into the fact that we had really just started the journey in acquiring the understanding of the sounds that were going to come in. Her identical twin absolutely loved her experience. She giggled through it. It was a total delight. She just floated out of there on cloud nine. She loved the experience. Also didn't understand what was being said, but she loved the whole experience. So for her, it was very positive. She loved getting the new, processor and the colors and things she had chosen. It was positive for her. And the third one, as much as I tried to have their expectations realistic too, she was gravely disappointed. So I remember at the time of switch on, she just dropped her head. And I was like, there was no smile, there was nothing. And in the car, I also said, so what happened? She said, oh, I'm just feeling very disappointed. I can't hear I can hear, but I can't understand what you're saying. And again, for all of them, it just took regular wearing, regular practice. And slowly but surely, they were able to comprehend. I think our fastest was 3 weeks before they could spontaneously recognize their name in a room when it was called. And then it went from strength to strength. So, but yeah, certainly that switch on time is variable in terms of how it's experienced, and isn't necessarily what we all see on YouTube. But Ronald, you had two different types of ages going on there, where mine were all sort of similar ages. And something that I know is a problem for families across the world, especially when their child is a little bit younger, is keeping those processes on. You kind of get to this huge point of having it done, the surgery and all that, which is so stressful. And then you finally get them, but then it's a mission to keep them on. And that stress and expectation, because we all know that only once they are wearing them for almost all of their waking hours can they really engage in this language learning process. So tell us some tips that you tried and used to have success with that, with keeping them on.
So I was fortunate, unfortunate, I don't know, with my kids, because they were exposed to using ear molds because they had hearing aids from a young age, and so they were quite adapted to that. So when we transitioned to the implants, we continued with the ear molds, and I found that it did bring some stability for them. So my older, she's probably at the age now where she could learn to balance her implant without the ear mold, but she is a really active child. She's in gymnastics, and so she feels a lot more secure with the ear mold because it does hold it in place. She is more confident. So that is the one option, and that we've tried. But we've also tried various other things. So some of the things we've also used, I also use a clothing clip, so a good quality one. That it's an absolute must, especially if you have an infant. Usually if you use a pacifier with an infant, they are already used to having something hanging on them with the pacifier clip. So similar concept. So this is very important for a younger baby or even a toddler, because they do tend to take their devices off at times, especially maybe at times of frustration, and they would want to fling it. So if they take them, pull them off the ears, at least they're hanging on their clothes and you have an opportunity to grab them before they go flying across the room. So definitely a good clothes clip is nice. For my daughter, because she has hair, nice long hair, clips as well. So hair clips worked, pretty hair bands worked. It needs to be tight enough to keep it in place, but not too tight to cause any kind of pressure. So you might have to go through a few hair bands, or you have to, you can make one on your own as well, a pretty hair band. And then we've also used things like a wig tape to hold it, to tape it to the skin. That didn't last long, because they had some irritation with the wig tape on their skin. And with kids, they will tell you what they like and what they don't like. But the one other thing that we tried was something called an activity clip, or a Huggies. Some of the brands they call it a Huggy. So it's just like a silicone attachment for the cochlea that will just have, it will just hook under the ear here, so that it holds it like secure this way. So we tried that. In my opinion, it's not as secure as the mold, but we have used that at times when we're transitioning between a mold, or a mold has broken or something like that. We have used it before. But for my family, for now, we're using the clothes hooks, and we're using the ear molds, and that works for us.
Okay, that's interesting, because I had a similar experience with ear molds. I found that was most secure. But I also found that it took a few months before they almost got used to how they carried their head. So
Absolutely.
a couple of months later, without the ear mold, it was just as secure. It was just odd, because it's not something you can physically see, but it definitely meant that they were able to just hold it better. And actually, I'm surprised at how secure they can be now. If ever we are engaging with a sport, for example, a ballet concert, and we don't want them falling on the stage in the middle of it or anything like that, I sometimes braid a piece of hair around the cable just to secure it. And in sport, we've used bands that have a little pocket for the processor itself to sit in. So one will have to problem solve. But just for any parents out there, realize that if you are struggling, you're not alone. This is a struggle that you're just going to need to figure out what works for you. It depends on your child's ear, how large, how sort of soft and bendable they are, essentially where things fit. And of course, any child that also wears spectacles, you're going to have a bit more to accommodate behind the ear. And now with the mask.
And then I think the last thing to mention is that there will be days when nothing will work. So
that's a good point.
And you, especially with babies, you will have those moments where nothing will work. So don't lose hope. We make it sound like it's easy, but it was trial and error and frustration mixed with all of this, and asking around. And just don't be afraid to try weird things. It really does depend on your child. Ask your child, how do they feel? And also ask your child for solutions. Sometimes they come up with brilliant things.
It's a good point. Yeah. Good point. So just a quick one on masks, since we're in the time of coronavirus, and if we ever watch this video in 10 years' time, that will be a distant memory. But essentially, the masks that tie individually around the head, we've found quite good, because they also even bring a bit more security. They lie over the cables, bring a bit more security, and they aren't competing for behind the ear. Anything that pushes it, it just becomes a mission. Now, in terms of the team, your hearing care team, when it comes to the implants, how important is it to you to have an ongoing relationship with the people in your team?
I think that is a core to making this journey as smooth and emotionally stable for the family unit as possible. And it is riddled with emotions, this journey, and it's very tiring, and it requires a lot of management. So if you have a good working relationship with your audiologist and your speech therapist, as well as with your your supplier, whoever they may be, I encourage parents to go that extra mile in developing that relationship and talking about your fears and really putting yourself out there, because it and also bringing your team together. So as far as possible, try to work with a team that's all that already knows each other, or if not, introduce them from the beginning so that you can all communicate, because you are representing your child, and so you need to be able to bring everybody on the same platform to effectively make decisions on behalf of your child. So they have to also be able to communicate with each other, for your child. So if you have communication problems from the start, before you even start your journey, I suggest you consider, finding the appropriate person that you could work with, because it is I would say, lifelong journey, because you're not going to just abandon your child when they turn 18 or 20. It's going to be a lifelong thing. You will be supporting them for a long time. So I suggest that the commitment is right up at the beginning. Be comfortable with the team, and don't be afraid to change then. I made a few changes at the beginning. It was uncomfortable at the beginning to do that. And sometimes the parent gets put in a corner, but understand that it is your decisions to make. You're doing it on behalf of your child. And don't be afraid, to make those decisions or make those changes. And yeah, so I think it's super important that you are very comfortable with these people. You will be interacting with them initially almost every 2 weeks, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis when you have to troubleshoot with problems. So you have to be very comfortable to interact and speak to them often. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think certainly at times it is extremely stressful. So
Yes.
I think that there are some times where the different elements of what can go wrong when it does go wrong, or the different concerns that you have, puts me in a feeling very vulnerable. And so certainly needs to be a team that you feel like you can be vulnerable with, and you can have a little cry
Yes.
when you're worried about something, or
Yes.
etc. And you know that they can hold you
Absolutely.
in that. And I think we've said this before on a school conversation. But as the parent, I think it's important for parents to realize that you're the one at the helm, at the steering wheel here. It's not the audiologist, it's not anybody else's responsibility to pull things together. And I think sometimes families expect that of the professional team, but actually it's your job. Um, and it's stressful. It is actually stressful if your speech therapist doesn't know your audiologist, or someone's giving you slightly different advice. And so early on, it's a great idea to link all elements of that team together and have an open communication between everybody so that it's comfortable and it's your go-to on, as you say, this lifelong journey. But now you've said something really interesting, and that was just, you mentioned it might be weekly, it might be every 2 weeks. I think a common thing that people wonder when they're looking at having their child have a cochlear implant is what's expected of me afterwards. So how often will I be going to the audiologist? This is related a little bit to costs, which we'll talk about in the second part. But how often? Am I going there every week, every month, every year? How often will I be seeing my audiologist?
Okay, so realistically, in after switch on, I think you have to go in after a week, and I think you go in almost weekly for that first month. And so they do something called mapping, and that's where they have to tweak and adjust the cochlear implant according to the needs of your child. So they would assess and see how is your child coping with the amount of current, or the volume, let's put it as volume, that the child is currently at. And so that can take a while. For some children who are already able to communicate their needs, it can be really quick. So if your child's older, it can be quick. But if you have a little one, like I had really little ones, and it was really a long process. It took us, for my older one, it took me about 6 weeks, I think, before we finally got to a setting that I felt she was getting enough access to sound. And for my younger one, it actually took 3 months. So we weren't going in weekly for 3 months. I think it was weekly for the first month. Thereafter, every 2 weeks, and then finally we get to a stage where we feel like it's a guess. Sometimes it's a guessing game, because when they're really young, you put them in the audiology booth to do the testing, and you don't get really good feedback. So as a parent, you also have to provide the feedback of what you are seeing in your home environment. That will also inform the decision of whether your child is getting enough access to sound or not. So it's not purely based on what's happening at the audiology rooms. So your input is very important in making those decisions of whether you go back or not. So all of that is important. And then you come to a stage where you say, okay, I think we're getting enough sound here. Let's go for a 3-month stretch. So in that first year, up to that 3-month mark, it's quite intensive. You'll be going very often. Expect to be going weekly, every 2 weeks. But after 3 months, it's every 3 months for the first year. I think that is the expectation. And after a year, you can expect to go every 6 months, maybe. And then if your child's really secure and able to do the audiology testing perfectly on their own, then you can go every year. So we're at the stage where we're going for my older one once a year, and for my younger one, we're still doing it every 6 months.
Okay, yeah, that's similar to us. And then obviously, if you hit a problem, it might require
Yes,
a season where you're going more often, or you're problem solving that a little bit.
yes.
So, yeah, those are all good points. Maybe you could just tell us about what your daily routine is. So, I know with anything new, every single time I've reached something new on this journey, it's taken some time before it just slots into a new normal. So, can you maybe just tell us how does your day look, and how is it different? How does the cochlear implant fit into your everyday?
Uh, yeah. I think it's important when you're in a family unit that you should have maybe at least one person that's delegated to take responsibility for, for managing all of the devices. And then, you train. I'm saying train because it does require some training. You train your helpers, you train your family members, you train other siblings or children. And then, of course, your spouses as well. You have to train them too. Um, so it's usually the moms who are wear the manager role. And so I think, you should, somebody should take responsibility for it. So that's the first thing, accept that it's your responsibility. And then, empower your child. I think that's the most important part. As soon as you are able, to empower your child, to teach them how to do it. And I know there is always that fear. You're dealing with something that's so expensive, and you don't want to have to go through parts and breakages, etc. But remember that this device does belong to your child. They do understand how important it is. They are the ones who need the access to sound. So the sooner you are able to teach them how to be independent with them, the better it would be for you in managing it. So that was my first step, is how quickly can I get them to learn how to tell me, when is it not working, when are the batteries dead, those kind of things. So so training, number one, appointing someone who is in charge of everything. And then so, from the morning to the night, then who would be delegated to to doing the afternoon switching of batteries. If you're not there, somebody has to make sure that they do that, if not the child themselves. Making sure in the morning we have a set morning routine. As soon as I get up, which is at 5 o'clock, I prepare all the devices. I have them, I lay them out for the kids, and with the batteries in, I prepare all the spare batteries, I put them in, I prepare all the FM systems, I put them in their school bags. So they're not at the stage where they can do that for themselves, so I do that for them. So I have to wake up an extra half an hour earlier in my day so that I can do that before they wake up, and so they are ready to go. And then in the afternoon when they come back, at least my helper helps with that, and she will manage batteries. But in the evenings as well, I have another routine where as when they're ready for bed, I have to put them in the dryer, make sure that all the batteries are getting charged, if they are rechargeable. And if you have disposable batteries, does it have enough life? Do you need to change them? I have a calendar up that I can mark off which days batteries were started, when do they need to be thrown away. So it really does need a proper routine and a tick box. We've worked with tick boxes and on timetables, and initially that's what we did. I've put everything down on routines, and because it is a lot to do and a lot to remember and process when you're first starting out. Now it's like second nature to us, but it's when you're starting out, I encourage you to create your lists and have your routines and visual schedules and whatever it may be. And visual schedules work well even for adults, especially spouses, because when you're trying to show them, okay, or explain this part and that battery, it's nice for them to see the picture of it. So that has also worked nicely. Yes. Sorry, I know I said too much there.
No, you didn't. I mean, if any professionals watching this, I think please appreciate the intensity of this journey, and it's definitely something to consider. You're committing yourself to a lifelong added intensity, which, as you say, becomes second nature, but it's still there. My kids are a bit older, so they take full responsibility for their routines. I just remind, and I've got little lists where they can double check. But certainly when something is momentarily lost, it causes a lot of stress in the home and the family, and it does sometimes concern me about this added responsibility that they do have. It's more than that they should have. And yeah, it's one of those things that I think is healthy to talk about in a family and to problem solve a little bit. When you go away from home, how does that change? Do you have a little kit? Because when we go away, we've got a little neat kit that's ready to be packed. Instead of putting them in an electronic dry box every night. So just for anybody who doesn't know, is that they'll need to be housed separate from the batteries while they are being charged, or if they're disposable, put somewhere safe where little people can't get hold of them, because that's a hazard, safety hazard if they had to swallow it or anything. But then they've got like this electronic little box that they get put into, take the moisture out, especially relevant for an environment like where we live that's very humid, because any moisture just causes problems with the device. And then, but when we go away, if it's a short amount of time, like just a weekend, a night or two, we have a sealed airtight Tupperware that has hundreds of those little moisture absorbent bricks that we put inside. And then we'll take one rechargeable battery thing, or sometimes we'll use disposable instead. And then I'll take a little extra cable, etc. Just one little pack of extras just in case something goes wrong, because the last thing you want is to be offline for the weekend when you plan to enjoy. But if we are going for longer, then it's a bigger box with the electronic stuff, etc. Do you do anything differently?
No, I think that's exactly it. The only thing I might do differently is sometimes the kids go without me. They go to grandparents' house for the weekend. And in those instances, I tend not to send them with the rechargeable batteries. I will just switch to disposable if that is an option for you. I mean, for some, the disposables are not an option. So then it's just much easier for grandparents and people to work with the disposables. So I might do that. But yeah, other than that, there's not much else I do. There have been times where, you forget the spare battery, and, it'll be on that day that the battery dies while you're in the middle of the mall. So it's not a train smash. You'd be surprised at how resilient your children are, and they cope. But yeah, these things are just, they will come naturally to you before you leave the house. Actually, now I just have batteries everywhere. I just have spare batteries everywhere. In my handbag, in my work bag. I have them at my mother's house, at my sister's house. They everywhere. So that's also an option. And in terms of the spare parts as well, when they're little, when they're older, it's easier to tell, which ones are the problematic parts. And you don't often go through a lot of parts when they're older, but when they're younger, you can go through a lot of parts. So I suggest that you keep quite a few of those, and you'd rather take more than less. Let's put it that way. You'd rather just carry more than less if you're going away for a weekend, or more than that. If it's just a day trip, that's fine. But take those cables, take all whatever spare parts you have, just take them with you. So when you have little ones, yeah.
And especially if you see that you're on your last part, to make sure that you've ordered them. They're all expensive, but it takes time to order them. And sometimes that stock even has to come from overseas. So never be sitting where you don't have extras, I think, is an important point. Just as we end this first part, did you ever, so people might not know, but you get different types of the external parts. So the internal part's a little wire that goes into your cochlea. I'm not going to explain it in super technical terms. It shouldn't need replacement in a lifetime, but there is a chance that it might need to be replaced, because usually the warranty is only about 10 years. So if you're getting implanted as a tiny person, there's a chance, but it's not something that's supposed to happen. The external part, however, gets upgraded. And in South Africa, we enjoy a 3-year upgrade if we've got medical aid that covers that, which is more frequent than many parts of the world. And so you get to choose which ones you want. And as new technology comes in, your kid notices the difference, etc. But essentially, you get the one that looks like a gigantic hearing aid that has a little cable that sits with a little magnet and coil that magnetically attaches to the magnet under the skin. Or you get the unit that doesn't have any of the area around the ear. It's called a single unit, and it just attaches directly on the magnet. When you've chosen your upgrades or your devices for your children, have you ever had that internal conversation about which one to opt for? And what were some of the things that made you think of one or the other?
So the supplier, the manufacturer, I think they tend to design the behind the ear unit, the BTU, for children. So when I asked for recommendations, they initially just offered that, and so they do design the single unit for older users or for adults. And the reason they said that is, I think, for stability, and also for and just for the child getting used to having having a device and being cognizant of a device. So I did try out the single unit for my daughter, but we did have a lot of issues with it. She was a lot younger, and I think we only lasted a year with the single unit, and we switched to the behind the ear unit, and she's been using that since. And that the main thing is that that we had then, and I'm sure it has improved since then, but then it just wasn't, the magnet wasn't strong enough. For her hair was quite thick, and it that was one of the main things, and it was also causing a lot of contact problems. So I think, being a single unit, the magnet needs to be quite strong, and it is a lot heavier on the head because it's the whole weight of the unit on the head. And I think it's a little tougher for a child to deal with that, or to handle that. So that was my experience with that. So, but I think certainly for an older child, and maybe one that's quite active, it was beneficial for her when she was doing gymnastics, because she used a headband and she was able to tuck it in, and it was really nice and secure, and she felt very confident in that aspect. So for sports and all of that, it's definitely the way to go for an older user, I feel. Somebody who can be responsible and can communicate if there's problems with it. Yeah, so that's my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those things where you've got to weigh up the pros and cons depending on the individual. Yes. And you'll have some people who absolutely love it and others that didn't find it was a great match. I think some of the things for me in terms of why the single unit does seem appealing is the fact that you don't go through cables. I find those cables are very, very yes. brittle. You look at them and they break. With girls that have long hair, the minute they get tangled in the hair and they put a little bit of pull on them to get them off, they can easily break. So you don't have those issues. And obviously, as technology improves, you'll get fancy ways of charging them, etc. But yeah, it's security on the head. The last thing I want is anything to be falling off and have to change magnets or anything like that in between. So I think, for anybody considering those options, just have a look to see what the brand that you're using has available, how technology is improved. If it's possible, try and get a trial so that you can actually experience when your child's doing their ballet, whether it's falling off or not. I think for me, something important is I wanted maximal microphone use, which did depend on which one we opted for. But it is something just to bear in mind for people looking at the different options that they might have. Thanks so much, Ronal. This was a great start to our conversation. We're going to end this one now, and please tune in for part 2. We're going to talk a little bit more about some practicalities around costs, because as in anything in this journey, when you're making a decision, it needs to be one that's informed so that there aren't any surprises along the way, and we hope that that is useful to you. So thanks so much for your time.
Great. See you soon. Thanks.